So to get started, what I want you to think about is what is the main metaphor that we use for parents when it comes to surviving, note my word choice, the teenage years. What? It's a phase, right? It's a phase. Don't worry, they'll get over it. We hear that all the time, right? We use language like, look, it's just something to be survived. Like, you've just got to get through it. It gets better, I promise, right? And over, we communicate to parents that teenagers are, in essence, a problem to be tolerated until they grow up to be real adults. And what I want to say is that I don't think that's helpful. I don't think it's a helpful analogy for society as a whole, but I especially don't think it's a helpful analogy for the church. I want us to think about, intentionally, what it would look like if instead of looking at adolescence like a problem to be solved, we looked at adolescence as a phase to be taken advantage of, the opportunities that come with it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. That right there is my family. We are sitting in front of the Epcot ball. I am a Disney junkie. You need to know that at the outset. This is everywhere where you can find me. This might be of use to you. YouTube, that's a long story. I'll tell you that later. The reason that might be useful is that I post everything I teach. So if you miss week 3 or any of those, you'll actually be able to go back and listen to it again. So, but if you want to find me, if you want to ask me questions, that is my email to get a hold of me. I'm happy to interact through questions, especially since I won't be able to stick around today because I have to run upstairs. But first week, stop picking your battles. Ingredients for kids who love the church. I have heard from a lot of parents, look, I'd have my kids in church, but I have to pick my battles, right? And I'm just not willing to fight that battle. And what I say is, well, what if you didn't have to pick it as a battle? What if instead of it being a battle, it was an opportunity? What if you had kids who loved the church, who wanted to go to church, and who were excited to go to church? But before I get to that, we need to do a little bit of a segue into what is an adolescent? What are these creatures, and how did we get them, and what do we do with them? So here is the simple, outright definition of an adolescent. The period following the onset of puberty during which a young person develops into a child, into an adult. Right? That is our textbook definition. Adolescence itself, by the way, is not a new phenomenon, but the identification of it as such is relatively new in the last 100 years. In fact, if you look, up until about 1900, we hadn't really talked about adolescence much. But starting in 1900 and peaking in the early 2000s, we started to get this idea of adolescence. Now, it's not new. If you look back in old Roman and Greek literature, they complained about this wild stage that kids got into at one point in life. But to actually identify it as a life stage and a developmental stage, that is actually somewhat new within the last 100 years or so. The other thing to understand is that adolescence as a phenomenon has been greatly aided by compulsory secondary education and the increasing number of students continuing into post-secondary ed, right? So there was a time when the majority of people in this country did not go to school beyond 8th grade, even if they were lucky. Now, everybody is supposed to go to school up through age 18, right? So there was a time in our society where 8th grade, you were done. Like, you didn't go to school anymore, you transitioned into a more adulthood role. In our society today, that's not happening, right? Our kids at 18, and in a community like this, most of them are looking at post-secondary ed, all right? The high school that my kids will attend, 90% of their graduates continue on to secondary ed, all right? So the overwhelming majority of our kids head toward college. What is it? And also, why has it changed? The age of puberty for the onset of it has been dropping steadily over the last 100 years. In 1900, most girls started puberty around age 16 or 17 years old. Today, the normal age range is 10 to 14, with some averages coming in around 10 and a half to 11 and a half years old. To put this into context, I am only 36. And in the time since I've been in middle school, the average age of the onset of puberty has dropped by a full year. Which means that developmentally, kids who were in 8th grade when I was are more like today's 7th graders. All right? Long story short, your children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, kids in your church are probably going to start puberty earlier than you did, all right? And just for textbook definitions, this is a great part about doing these presentations. The official indicators of start of puberty are menarche, first period for a girl, and first ejaculate for a boy, okay? In some cases, though, the other characteristics of puberty appear well before that, all right? But we're talking about 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds as far as starting out in puberty. Adolescence leads to changes in every area of life: physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, social, relational, and family. Going to stop there. How many of you have a teenager now, 13 or above? How many of you will have a teenager, 13 or above? How many of you have had one who's 13 or above? Okay? So this list should not surprise any of you who have lived with teenagers, right? It affects every aspect of their life, and in fact, it should. But one of the things for us to grasp how to best leverage, how to best take advantage of this stage of life, is to understand what are the tasks of adolescence. And here we go. Adolescents are seeking to find the answers to three fundamental questions. Number one, who am I? That's a question of identity and self-understanding. And let me explain something real quick. The only reason that adolescents can even ask this question is that their brain has started to shift. Okay, I'm not a neuroscientist, but from what I have read and what I understand, the brain begins a fundamental shift during puberty, and it changes how kids can think. Specifically, it changes that they can now think abstractly. And once you begin to think abstractly, you actually can conceive of an idea outside of yourself. So if I said to my 9-year-old son, Andrew, what do you think about yourself as a self? He would look at me like I had really lost it. Okay? But if you talk to a 14-year-old and you were to say, how do you understand yourself? What would you say about yourself as a person? That's a question that they can engage with much more so than a 9-year-old or 7-year-old. My son would say, I like Taekwondo. A 14-year-old might give you social identifiers. Well, I'm friendly. I've got friends, I'm smart, and this and that, right? They're beginning to understand who they are, but they're wrestling to try and figure out who they are. The second one, whose they are. The question of belonging. All right? Now, your experience may differ from mine, but I was fascinated when I was in student ministry week by week, around late August, when the school schedules would be posted online or mailed home. And everyone would take out their cell phones and take pictures of their schedule. And the first question they wanted to know was who was in their classes, and specifically, who did they have lunch with? Right? Forget everything else. Forget if they messed your schedule up, if you're in the wrong classes. Do I know somebody at lunch? Think back, if you can, to those middle school years. By God's grace, many of us simply let them wash away. Right? Lunch is terrifying. Where I grew up, elementary school was easy, right? You all sat at two tables, all the same class. Middle school was a social free-for-all. Whose am I? And finally, what am I good at? This idea of competencies, right? What can I do? That's wrong. It's not affinity. It's competencies. What am I good at, right? How many kids, at least, I'll tell you, Hampton Township where I live, every kid plays soccer. Every kid, right? Every kid has one of these yellow Hampton soccer shirts that they're wearing around. And then eventually some of them figure out that they don't like soccer. Right? My son hated soccer because he hated getting knocked down. So he quit doing soccer, right? Kids by middle school, especially adolescents, are trying to figure out what they're good at. Because they're starting to figure out that they're not as good as everybody else, right? I desperately wanted to be a hockey player growing up, but I couldn't skate, right? So there went that dream down the tubes. It's not going to happen, okay? But these are the fundamental questions. Who am I? Whose am I? What am I good at, right? And if you think about your teenager right now, you can probably think of little ways that you are finding this out, right? How many of you have girls? Okay, if you have a daughter, I hope you resonate with this, right? This thing of belonging can be traumatic for an adolescent. Because the friends they were friends with in elementary school, they're no longer friends with. Suddenly, these friends that they've had since first grade, second grade, third grade, they're just not friends with. anymore. Adolescence leads to a lot of changing friendships for girls, and they seem to care. It does for guys too, but most 11 and 12-year-old guys don't even know to pay attention to changing friendships. Really. I mean, I love them. But they're much more interested in doing, right? But that can be really traumatic. Traumatic about affinity? Oh my gosh. Have any of you had a kid who got cut from a sports team? I still remember one of my high school freshmen who we knew it was coming. I mean, her dad and I had talked. She was not going to make the soccer team. She was 4'3". She got cut. She was devastated. Absolutely devastated. Because suddenly, something that she felt that she was good at, she was told she wasn't. Okay? So, all these. And then, who am I? Think about the physical changes that puberty brings. Your body starts doing things that you don't even know what they mean or how to feel. And you start feeling ways that you've never felt before. And you start feeling things you've never felt before. You start to smell funny. You start to have to shower more often. You have to start using deodorant. Right? These are all a lot of changes that they're going through. And the best part is they all happen at the same time. So these are the three fundamental questions that our adolescent kids are trying to wrestle with. Okay? Here's the big thing. They're all interrelated and they can't be separated out cleanly. Okay? Like, you can't say, well, so-and-so is working on identity right now. They're all connected. They're all interwoven. But this is the one, and unfortunately it gets cut off on the bottom. But what we've observed, and this is not me, but what we have observed is that over time, the priority of these shifts. Okay? Now, I know when I was growing up, which I was a teenager in the early 90s, like basically through the 90s, okay? At that point in time, I would say that I pretty much structured myself around what I was good at and let that drive the other two, all right? I figured out I can't skate, but I weighed 90 pounds going into high school. I could probably run. So I joined the cross-country team, right? I answered an affinity question, what might I be good at, and then chased the other two through that I was a runner and that I had a sense of belonging with the team, all right? And what a lot of you would have grown up with is this kind of strict, almost social hierarchy in schools, right? Where there were ranks, all right? You had the most popular kids and the least popular kids, and you could almost list them in order. What I can tell you now is that world is gone. The druggies and the burnouts think they are as cool as the football players, and they don't care. The band geeks make fun of the football players. They think it's hilarious. I have been shocked over the course of the last decade to watch this social, what used to be hierarchy, get crushed. Okay? Because they don't care. Everything is driven, in my read, by belonging. You find your people, and then you find what you're good at. You find who accepts you, and that's where you go. That's how you come to understand yourself. You're still working on identity, belonging, and affinity, but belonging drives the bus. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to stop there. Any questions on my real quick overview of adolescent psychology, adolescent development? Any questions so far?
Why do you see the shift happening?
So I think it's a shift that we're seeing in our broader society too, of where everything's kind of gone flat, right? So if you think back, we used to have a society in which the flow of information was very clearly articulated, right? It went to newspapers, from newspapers to your front door, to television shows in your home. We now live in a society where everything is flat, right? You can get Facebook Live from Washington yesterday. Nobody's going to make any sort of intermediary, right? Direct connections. What I've observed is that as kids have been able to network differently and connect electronically, suddenly what used to be so important of social hierarchy just doesn't matter, right? They can be friends with whoever. I have been shocked at the number of kids who have told me about friends, and I go, wait, where is this friend? Oh, we're friends on Xbox. The number of kids who are connecting online through gaming platforms, right? These are their people. These are their friends. I know kids who have dated over Xbox, all right? I think that is the nerdiest thing in the world, by the way. But, I love them. So I think in large part it's been driven by technology. It's kind of flattened out the whole thing to where it just doesn't matter as much. Other questions before I move on?
Are you moving on to answer the belonging part? If not, I have a question.
Give me your question.
Okay. So I have a junior in So the sixth grader, she's starting sixth grade social. What you described exactly is what happened. She no longer has the friends she had before. She has lonely friends. I don't know these girls.
Yes.
So you're saying belonging is extremely important, and I have my 12-year-old reaching out to all these people, and she comes home with these names, and I don't know who they are. I don't know who their parents are. I don't know what their beliefs are.
Yep.
So then what?
We'll get there. Okay. Now, if you heard the sermon already, I talked about this a little bit, but I'm going to go over it a little bit more. This is a non-scientific graph, okay? This is Brian playing with an Excel spreadsheet to develop a graphic. So these percentages are not exact. But what I call is the influence gap. Over the life of a child, the amount of influence you have in their lives as parents drops, okay? But this is necessary. After all, you don't want your kid living in your basement when they're 35. They have to grow up, they have to become independent, and therefore your influence has to decrease. All right? The size of this gap shifts over time with some accelerated periods of growth at specific points. And parents, this is the most important thing. If you zone out after this, take this home. You remain the most important influence in a child's life until they leave your house. Never forget that. Never let anyone tell you it's not true. And never let your kid tell you it's not true. And never let yourself tell you it's not true. You remain the number one influence the whole way through. That is proven over years and years of research. But this is what it looks like. The blue is your influence as a parent. The gray is the influence gap. When they are born, you have everything, right? You control it all. What they eat, where they go, what they wear, and over time it starts to open up, right? But this normally gets filled in by what? Grandparents, aunts, uncles, preschool teachers, friends who, exactly as you said, you control them, right? When our son started hanging out with a friend that we did not like, we simply added a corrective. Andrew, we really don't want you hanging out with him anymore. Okay, done. There's it. End of the story. But when they're 5, you can pull that off, okay? But over time, this gap begins to grow. All right? First significant gap is here. Anyone want to guess what that is? It's about age 11. Puberty! Onset of puberty, right? All of a sudden, that brain starts to shift, and your influence begins to drop. Okay? Next one, over here.
First date.
Bird, you saw the slide earlier. You're kidding. Dating and driving, right? All of a sudden, especially when dating kicks in. Now, don't get me wrong, all right? I know that there are middle school relationships going on up here, but I'm telling you, the ones that really matter start around here, all right? If you have a daughter, they often start younger. If you have a son, often a little bit longer, but it all revolves around driving. Suddenly, the health and welfare of your child can be in somebody else's hands who's not an adult, right? Your influence is dropped. And then, the end, post-secondary grade, right? Suddenly, they go off. So this is basically, again, non-scientific, but it gives you a visual. Early on, lots of influence, and you control a lot of these sources. But by the end, that gap is really, really, really big. All right? But here's my idea. The church, in partnership with parents and guardians, is uniquely positioned in a positive, life-transforming, and sustainable way to address the 3 central questions of adolescence. Okay? Now, I'm going to go on this. Why the church? Why do I think the church? Because, let's be honest, in our society, the number of people who are attending church is dropping. And the number of people who believe in God stays the same. But the number of people who are actually showing up is dropping. And even the ones who are showing up less frequently. Right? Weekly church attendance used to be very much embedded into our society. It's not anymore. Now, we talk more and more about people who come every week, twice a month, once a month. Right? So, you can make the case that the church is one of the worst places to try and do this, but I still think it's one of the best. And number one, we don't age out, right? Your kids will age out of things. My son will age out of his school. He will age out of his teachers. We don't age out of the church. The church is always there for us. Number 2, there are certain areas of our lives that only the church addresses. Abstract, transcendent, spiritual questions, right? Our teachers, and by the way, if you're a public school teacher, I love public school teachers. I married one, my mother was one, and I have 3 aunts who are one. So please do not take this wrong. But our teachers are not permitted, not allowed, nor should they be, for the record, to address spiritual, religious questions in our students. It's not their job. All right? But because of that, they oftentimes shy away from other abstract, transcendent, and spiritual questions because they don't want to get in trouble. Right? The church is the only one that addresses it. When kids are learning how to think abstractly, we're still using very concrete teaching methods in middle school. When kids are asking meaning questions of life, we're teaching them about George Washington and the Revolutionary War. Now, we should teach them all those things, don't get me wrong. But nobody else is asking them about themselves. The only kids who get asked about themselves are the kids who are struggling so much. At that point, they're then sitting in the guidance counselor's office or a therapist's office. We don't ask every kid, tell me how you're doing as you're growing, right? The church does that. That is what the church does. That is our business. The church is both intensely individual and intensely community-oriented all at the same time. And this is so critical, right? Because when I work with students, I'm concerned about two things. I'm concerned about them as an individual, but I'm also very concerned about them as a community and a team, right? Here's the beautiful thing about the church. Inclusion in the church isn't performance-based, but it's relationally based, right? If you stink at soccer, come to church. If you're amazing at soccer, come to church. If you love piano, come to church. If you love to push buttons and run soundboards, come to church. All right? We are relationally based instead of a metric based. Kids at school are metric based all the time. The classes they're in are metric based, right? Are they good enough to be in the AP classes and in the honors classes? Or are they in the learning support classes? They're constantly dealing with metrics in their lives. Are they good enough to make the team? If they make the team, are they good enough to get playing time? I ran cross country. You know why? No cuts. But I still knew I wasn't very good. Right? I still knew that I was 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th on the team. So even though I was part of the group, I I still knew, yeah, running's not your thing, buddy. Right? Like don't make a career out of it. The church is like that. We are relationally based rather than a metric based, a performance based. The church can foster vital adult-child relationships in a unique way that nobody else can. If you heard my sermon, you heard the story of Miss Tracy. If you haven't heard it yet, you'll hear it at the end. But look, like, I knew kids, all right? I grew up in church. It was not a big, fancy church. It was a 150-member church, little New England-style sanctuary. We had nothing, all right? My youth group was me. I was the youth group for a long time. But there are people in that church who are still there today who literally changed my diaper, which is incredibly embarrassing, by the way, when you go home to preach. But still, right? I didn't age out. They knew me the whole way through. Those vital relationships that kids just don't get anywhere else. Coaches, again, I love coaches. I was a volunteer coach for a while. But eventually, you go off the team, right? Eventually, things change. Eventually, there's other students coming into those classrooms for the teachers that your kids love. But the church is the one thing that has the least turnover of people. When your college kids, when your kids grow up and come home at Christmas, they can still see some of the same people who they saw for the last 20 years in the church. I loved Christmas Eve when I served the church. Not because I was happy to see the college kids. I usually saw them more. I was happy to see them, see the other adults that they had known their entire life, right? Nobody else, no other organization in our society does this, okay? Here's the other thing. If you want a kid to flourish in life, help them develop as a leader. We in the church can do leadership development, service, and learning in a way that nobody else can. Remember what I just said. If you're good at piano, come to the church. If you're good at sports, come to the church. The beauty of the church is that the church thinks creatively. They can find ways to use every kid's gifts they've got. Right? We had kids at the church I served who loved running sound. You know why? They couldn't kick a soccer ball to save their life. But man, they could show up on Sunday morning and they could run the soundboard. And that was important to them. One of my first strategies, and we didn't do it perfectly, but one of our first strategies is to figure out how do we get kids plugged into something deeper and more meaningful. All right? I'm going to talk about this at the end. The church is based at its best on grace and reconciliation, which are difficult to find in our society. This is actually getting worse. I'm not a doomsday person. Things are so much worse than they used to be. But you have not grown up in a world where you can be shamed online when you're 13. And that happens frighteningly often. Where tweets are directed at certain people, Snapchat, right? And I'll get on Snapchat later, and I'll give you my whole rant why I hate Snapchat, but just know it's coming. But because it allows shaming so easily, right? So, but we're based on grace and reconciliation. I used to tell my seniors, my charge to my seniors was, when you screw up, call me. Not if, when. All right, I was a realist. Right? When you make mistakes in your life, the church at its best is based on grace, reconciliation, and forgiveness. Our society is not based on that. Okay? Just saying. All right, but here's the key ingredient. It's partnership. It's partnership. Here's what we tend to do. All right? The church tends to do one of two things. We either use what I call the export approach or the return to sender approach. The export approach is adopted by parents. And it says, look, I'm going to take my kids to church, I'm going to set them down, and oh man, the Spirit's just going to fill them, and they are going to come out religious, well-behaved, moral kids. Church leaders, on the other hand, use return to sender and say, we don't know what to do, so it's the parents' fault. Right? And this is what we do. Again, export or return to sender. And when I talk to church leaders, it's always this. It's always a blame game about the parents. And when I talk to parents, it's always a blame game about the church. This is the problem, right? We aren't thinking in partnership. Here's what I want you to think of, the orange model. And I stole this. I did not come up with this. There's a whole conference called the Orange Conference based on this. This is not my idea. But it's brilliant, right? You take the church, which is based on love. That's red. You take the family, which is how we do life. That's yellow. You make it orange, right? This partnership between the church and the family. Okay? What I want to tell you is about these two people. Okay? Because to understand what I'm saying, I want you to get a grip. And yes, we were just in a mud pit when this photo was taken. On the left, this is Casey. I met Casey when she was in 6th grade. Casey was in our youth group, and Casey, God love her, tried to jump a fence one day. She missed and split her pants wide open in the middle of middle school youth group. Can you imagine a more mortifying experience as a 6th grader than ripping your jeans at youth group? But Casey got it, and Casey was incredibly gifted. And we said, all right, Casey, we're going to turn you into a leader. And she did. She did everything. She taught Sunday school. She went on mission trips with the junior high when she was in senior high. She went on mission trips when she was in college. I needed an adult leader quick last fall. I called her. She happened to be home. She went. This past fall, Casey enrolled to begin the process of becoming an ordained pastor in the Presbyterian Church. Why? Because she sorted out her adolescence through the church. Those 3 fundamental questions we helped her work through in the church. That's the good story. This one's better. That's Jaden. That's the worst behaved kid I've ever had in history. Seriously. 3 states, 4 churches, worst kid I've ever had. Most of 6th grade youth group, he spent in the corner with his nose against the wall because it was the only way I could get him to hold still. In 8th grade, Jaden really messed up. Made a big mistake. And his mother drove him, where else? To the church. She comes in and says, you need to talk to Jaden, but he won't get out of the van. So I go out, Mr. Me, I open the van door and I go, get out of this van! Scare the bejeebies out of the kid. We come inside. He said, Brian, I can't tell you what I did. And I said, you can tell me what I did because I forgive you already, just tell me. He said, you forgive me already? You don't even know what I did. I said, it doesn't matter. It's forgivable. Just tell me what you did. He told me what he did. And I said, man, that was really dumb. I was like, you should not have done that. He's like, I know, and I feel awful. And I said, you know what? It's okay. It can all be forgiven. We're going to work through this. That spring, my wife comes up to me, who did our children's ministry work, and she said, Brian, I think Jaden should help with preschool. I was like, that is the dumbest idea you've ever had. He is not doing that. That kid can't walk straight himself. He was amazing working with preschool kids. And at the end of that week, I said, buddy, you are helping out all summer. And he did. He helped out with our day camp. He was amazing. All of a sudden, in 9th grade, things turned around. He walked a straight and narrow path. Oh, no, he didn't. He kept screwing up. He kept doing these really dumb things where he'd tell me and be like, why did you do that? You know better. And yet we continued to forget and work through. And he grew, and he grew, and he grew, and he grew. And over again, he showed his leadership ability. When that kid was a junior in high school, I gave him, as part of a day camp, Squad 1. Those are my youngest boys. You don't give your youngest boys to anybody but your very best counselor. In a counseling staff full of college students, he was a junior. He was the best. He worked with those boys. He was beloved. He graduated from high school, spent a year traveling the world serving in missions, is now the intern at the church where I used to serve, continuing to nurture and guide the next generation. I tell you these two stories because they are in some ways opposite. This kid was on the right path from the start, right? We had to do so little. It was a case of don't mess her up. This kid, he said to me, and I kid you not, he said to me this fall, he said, I really wonder if I might not be in jail if it wasn't for the church. And he wasn't being sarcastic, right? He was so prone to poor decision making and impulsive choices. He legitimately asked himself, would he be in jail if it wasn't for the church? Yet here's the key thing I want you to know. For both of these kids who've done amazing things, the critical ingredient was that we had the parents. We had the parents, and there was a partnership. Casey's parents, Jaden's parents, both. We had a great partnership. There was open communication. We talked. We built on one another. We cried together. We celebrated together. Okay? There was partnership. Nothing happens with our kids until the church and the parents start working together. So, how are we going to get there? Next week, come here, Duffy. That 3 p.m. time is wrong. It's 4. All right? But then these are the 3 things I'm going to tackle. And you'll notice that they're each based on one of those questions, right? February 5th, can I ask that? Helping students deal with questions of identity and belief, right? What do we do when our good, church-loving kids start saying, I don't know if I believe that anymore. I don't know if I want to go to church anymore. I don't know if I'm sure of any of this anymore. I don't even know who I am anymore. How do we deal with those questions? Because how we deal with those questions is critical. Moving beyond fine, developing transformative relationships with your teens and their friends, right? We're going to talk about believing. We're going to talk about belonging. How do you create a sense of belonging? I'll give you a preview, and this gets to your question, right? And I have time. I loved the interactions with something like this. Girl A comes in and is like, oh my gosh, I cannot stand my mom. Her friend. What are you talking about? Your mom is so cool. I love your mom. Girl A, you're crazy. No, I love your mom. Oh my gosh, Miss Claire is amazing. One of the leverage opportunities that you have is in the lives of your kids' friends. But to leverage that opportunity, you've got to know how to ask the questions, right? How was school? Fine. Right? How was school? Fine, right? How was the mission trip? Fine. How was the retreat? Fine. How was Sunday school? Fine. We're going to talk about questions specifically that can move you beyond just fine, right? How do you ask open questions that ask for depth and create exploration and communicate meaning and care? That goes a long way toward answering the belonging question. And last, faith is a verb, helping teens discover their God-given gifts for ministry. You want to see a kid take off in church? You want to see a kid take off in life? Help them find where their leadership really matters, where they belong, and where they can really let their gifts loose. One of the kid that I will tell you that week was another one of Jaden's friends, was a kid who was already into low-level crime when I met him in 8th grade. And we reoriented his gifts and set him on a whole new path. But it took finding what he loved and finding a way for him to serve the church. So I appreciate your patience. I appreciate your time. Any questions about where I'm going, what I said, anything at all?
So next week, the 4 p.m. seminar will be different from the 10 a.m. class.
Correct.
Okay. 10 a.m. is more directed towards what Brian's talking about, this church-parent partnership. 4 p.m. is really for parents and teens. He's going to do some workshop, seminar. It should be about an hour and a half.
Any other questions, comments, things you like, things you disagreed with?
You have to deal with sports in the church, and you talk about why people aren't coming to church.
Yeah.
is the whole process of parents in all the youth sports that we're going with. And how do we manage that? Because it's a struggle for us.
Sure. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to think of the church and the home like two dials. When you dial one dial back, you've got to turn the other one up. Okay? So what I tell parents who have sports and Sunday morning sports and that kind of stuff is that if your kid can't be in church as often, you need to amp up at home. All right? Here's one of the things. I had a family who loved to ski. They loved skiing. They went skiing all winter. And what I said, look, we post all our sermons online. You should listen to the sermons in the car as you're coming home from skiing, right? So if, just by realities of kids' schedules and everything else, the church can't be as big of a role, then the intentional practices at home need to be amped up.
I think we as parents who have had kids unfortunately, we didn't have our kids go through some of the stuff that kids are going through today. But I think we can be great therapists, just to listen.
No, you are absolutely right. One of the things that I always loved doing, and this was the value of being somewhere for 10 years, is when I was confronting a situation with a kid and a parent, and I knew another parent had dealt with it, I could connect the two. And I would say, oh, you need to go talk to Jeannie, she had it far worse, trust me, right? But to do that kind of work, because that's really important. As parents, part of those baptismal vows is that we pledge to support the parents. And so, yeah, I think your point about being a listening board and a therapist for parents who are going through it now is a great one.
It sounds like you're also going to address this one, so you don't have to address it today. But my 12-year-old does not want to go to Sunday school or youth group, and I don't want to force her because I don't want her to hear. But right now, she's helping my husband teach elementary school, Sunday school, rather than youth group.
Right.
If she won't step in the door, I don't know how to get her involved. And at the same time, I feel like if I force her, then she'll hate it.
Sure. Okay, so, and this is not a foolproof method, right? But usually when you're working with a kid who won't do something, you need to change strategy, right? The same strategy of asking, hey, do you want to go? No, isn't going to do it, right? So the strategy that I often would use and saw parents use very well is, okay, what can I do to help this person develop an intentional connection with someone who does go, all right? So you can't call them play dates once they're 12. That's not cool anymore. But one of the things that one of my moms did, and this is brilliant, is she decided that she was going to target one of her daughter's acquaintances as the person who she wanted to get her closer connected to. And she would say to her, hey, we're going such and such, why don't you invite so-and-so? So she intentionally built a connection between her daughter and that kid. And then she went one step further and built an intentional connection between that other kid and the mom. So she worked the whole way to make sure the mom knew her daughter, that the daughter knew her daughter. And the last step that she did is she called me and said, I want you to invite my daughter to come on Sunday. I've done, and here's what I've done, but I want you to invite her. So I did. I was like, hey, why don't you come? No. Shot me down. Didn't even think about it. Didn't even hesitate. I mean, it was as cold as I've ever been shot down. And I said, come on, like just once. No. Next week. I know you're coming this week, right? I mean, like we were relentless, but it took the pressure off of the parent, right? Like it put the pressure on the other mom and the friend and myself, who were the ones. And she started complaining to her mom. She's like, they won't leave me alone. Well, why don't you just go? Maybe then, So see if you can leverage a way to take the pressure off you, to get other people involved. Because kids tend to take pressure from other people better than they take it from ourselves as parents, right? And I'll talk about this, I think, week 2, about community. But the frustrating thing about parenting adolescents is suddenly you're not enough. Your opinion is not enough. You don't know enough. And it's actually obnoxious because, I'll be honest, 12-year-olds, they're not very smart. They're not. I mean, they can do that, but they couldn't survive very long on their own. But what's interesting about it is that kids would come to me and ask me something, and I knew it was a setup. I knew that they had heard it at home. And then the parent would come to me and be like, I don't understand why my kid listens to you better than me. I'd say they don't. It's third-party confirmation. It's third-party validation. They need that third-party validation. So I push them over the edge. Well, you got them. Same thing. Think about trying to leverage a different way. Instead of you pushing, how can you kind of be like, get her pulled along? That'd be my 2-minute response. Anything else?
You have to preach.
I do have to preach.
You get to preach
I
then.
get to
So
preach.
thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm really